all of these comparisons that people draw between Xi Jinping is like an emperor. You see this all the time in American publications. It's just ridiculous. He's so much more powerful than any Ming emperor.
Here's a story you've heard before. In 1840, British gunboats humiliated the Qing Empire. A century of suffering and humiliation followed until revolution ended the humiliation in 1949. It's the story that the Chinese Communist Party teaches in almost every Chinese classroom. It's also the story that American universities have taught for 70 years about Chinese history. And according to my guest today, well, it's not history, it's mythology. Welcome to Peking Hotel. My name is Leo. My guest today is Dr. Alice Miller, a Qing historian who spent 16 years analyzing Chinese politics at the CIA and later founded the China Leadership Monitor at the Hoover Institution, where she is now a research fellow. And in part 2 of our conversation, Alice takes apart the myth and the man who canonized it in America, King Fairbank. She tells us why the story of modern China begins really in 1550, not 1840. Why Xi Jinping is not really an emperor, is far more powerful than that. And why engagement didn't fail. It worked so well that Xi Jinping had to stomp on it. And so here's my conversation with Dr. Alice Miller. So last time we spoke about your job analyzing Chinese politics for the CIA. And this time I would like to talk to you about your academic career and your views on how American scholars have analyzed China. And so you began studying China in the 60s at Princeton, I believe. How did you develop your interest in Chinese empires?
I mean, that's very distant from, physics and engineering and Greek and Latin and Sanskrit.
I blame Fritz Mote. He was such a great teacher. He co-taught the original Chinese language courses, but he also taught the courses on the later empires. And so his courses were just fascinating. That just really piqued my curiosity. The impression you get from basic textbooks is, if you've seen one dynasty, you've seen them all because of the dynastic cycle, and so forth. But you actually begin to take the dynasties apart and look at their events and trends much more closely. It doesn't look like that at all. The dynastic cycle idea is wrong. The Qing is not like the Ming, and the Ming is not like the Song, certainly not like the Yuan, and so forth. And so you begin to get a closer understanding of the trends in Chinese history, and you begin to see that the really big trends are not the changes of dynasties. It's more fundamental changes undergoing the economy and society. There are longer trends in society and economy that transcend the dynasties, and their starts don't coincide with dynastic transition. For example, the Tang period, the middle of the Tang in the 8th century, a fundamental shift in taxation fundamentally changes, begins to break the aristocratic system of land ownership, and creates a situation that leads to what flourishes in the Song. Very different land tenure relationships, where the political elites come from, and so forth. And so once you begin to see those things, it's just an endlessly fascinating. There's just not enough time, not too much to read nowadays.
And you studied China in an era when the great men of China studies, such as Fritz Mote and King Fairbank, were still around. Could you talk about them?
Fairbank is one of the great founders of China studies. He did a lot of things to help establish it in the wake of World War II and the Communist Revolution in China. Theodore de Bary at Columbia was one of the great men at that time. Mote, Franz Michael from the University of Washington, he was my later mentor when I'm in graduate school. Arthur Wright at Yale, although his reputation I think is overblown.
Why?
Sorry?
Why? I mean, why do you think it's overblown?
He didn't do all that much. He wrote a book on Buddhism in China, a little book, and not much else. His wife, Mary Wright, was much more important. She's a little younger than that founding generation, but she was a great scholar. Wrote a book on the Tongzhi Restoration in the 1860s and the self-strengthening movement, a book I'm quite critical of, but it's still a good book. And then wrote a book, a conference volume on the 1911 revolution, which completely overturned the kind of conventional story of the 1911 revolution. And so she was important. Joseph Levinson at Berkeley. Who else?
Robert Scalapino came back to Berkeley later.
Yes, and he spent a lot of time working on Japan and Asia more generally.
I think there was another guy at Berkeley.
I'm not sure who. Benjamin Schwartz.
Yeah, Benjamin
Harvard.
Schwartz.
Yeah, he was at Harvard.
Oh, at Harvard.
Yeah, he wrote a book that a lot of people liked on the rise of Mao Zedong. I didn't like it very much.
Yeah.
But he was, frankly, I think, more interested in European intellectual history because he'd write about Chinese intellectual history, but use the Europeans as a reference. And his books would have long sections on European history, which I think was what he really liked.
And what distinguished them? Were they in some sort of debate with each other over topics and methods?
The most important debates were people who worked on contemporary China. And so people at Harvard, like Schwartz and Fairbank, had built up an interpretation of the 1949 revolution as reflecting the outgrowth of trends from the 19th century in Chinese social history. And so in that sense, the communist revolution was more Chinese than it was inspired by the Soviet Union. Others, people like Franz Michael, argued that the communist revolution really reflected Soviet influence, and the Kuomintang and the Russians had strongly influenced the communist movement. There were differences within the movement, but the Soviets lent great support to the revolution. And in the end, the revolution was primarily a military victory. And so they disagreed with Fairbank and argued that this foreign impact and the roots of the communist movement are more important than the emphases that Fairbank and people like him focused on. That debate was important because it fit into a broader political debate in the United States over who lost China. And the Republicans gained control of Congress, I think, in 1948, and they began to make China policy an issue to attack the Truman administration. And when the revolution succeeded, the question of who lost China to the United States became important in American politics, and this academic debate fed into that. Fairbank argued that, well, the United States didn't have China to lose, and besides, it's a Chinese revolution. The other side argued that the U.S. did lose China by failing to recognize how it was really a revolution supported by the Soviet Union, and this is as the Cold War was getting going. So those academics debates was really ferocious, heated, and continued on through the 1950s into the early 60s. By that time, everybody was tired of it. Nobody cared anymore. And then the American involvement in Vietnam started in 1964, 65, the introduction of American troops and so forth. And so the question of the nature of the Vietnamese Revolution became important, and therefore the lessons of China's revolution became important for Vietnam. And all those arguments came back again, and everybody fought with each other for a long time. So those were the dominant debates.
Interesting.
Yeah, the period before modern times was still pretty underdeveloped. There just weren't that many people working on it. And so the kinds of differences that have emerged in later decades hadn't appeared yet. They're still laying the foundations. The best, a really substantial textbook on Chinese history really didn't come, for traditional times, didn't come until the early 1960s. Fairbank wrote it with Edwin Reischauer and Albert Craig. That was the textbook I used to learn my first course on traditional Chinese history. And so it took the early 60s for that to appear. So the kinds of debates that infected the contemporary China studies didn't figure very much in the earlier periods. Nobody knew enough about Han times or the origins of the Qing Empire or anything like that to really have major differences.
I wonder, how do you evaluate the legacy of Fairbank?
Well,
he obviously has a view, and the view affects politics, and
yes.
He has a huge lineage of academic offsprings. Now they're all over American universities.
Yes. Well, I think intellectually and sociologically, there are reasons to be critical. I do credit him with playing a huge role in establishing Chinese studies in this country. And his efforts and being at Harvard played a key role in establishing the field. He may get a little bit too much credit because there are other people who were important as well. And some of his scholarship hasn't stood up very well. And that's sort of natural. He was responsible for helping to introduce and lay out kind of foundational knowledge about China. But as later generations come, they're naturally going to revise and reinterpret and criticize what was there set down by him. And that's true of him. It's true of everybody. History isn't a pile of bigger and bigger pile of facts. It's a conversation, and history changes as time goes by because the questions that people are interested in change. The inspiration for the questions changes according to their own times, and so they're going to look at past periods that have been discussed already in new ways. So that's normal. I'm quite critical of some of Fairbank's views. Intellectually, he's pretty much the progenitor of the standard story of modern Chinese history organized around two dates, 1840 for the Opium War and 1949, the Communist Revolution. And so the story of modern China is the challenge of the West introduced in the Opium War, and then the consequences. China's traditions weren't adequate for China to become a capable modern country in the modern world, so it needed a revolution, and that revolution was the Communist Revolution. That's kind of the conventional story, and if you read textbooks these days, it still is. But I don't like that story. I'm trying to write a book now that offers a very different story of how we get to the China today, and it starts in 1550. The key dates in my chronology are 1550 and 1901. The conventional interpretation is that it's sort of a revolutionary reaction to the intrusion of the West in 1840 with the Opium War. And so the Opium War demonstrated that the traditional Chinese politics could not be an effective basis for adaptation to the modern world created by the West. And so their tradition had to be abandoned. They had to establish a new way of doing things, and therefore they required a revolution. And that's what the communists represent. So the key dates are 1840 with the Opium War, when the West intruded, and 1949 when the People's Republic was created. And so despite being a revolutionary regime, the People's Republic in many ways continues many of the characteristics of the imperial regime. So Mao Zedong looks like an emperor. The Chinese communist bureaucracy looks like the Confucian bureaucracy. Contemporary Chinese foreign policy really wants to restore the old tribute system of foreign relations.
The Tianxia system.
Yeah, that's right, Tianxia system. That's the standard story. My book project tries to do something different and argue that the modern Chinese state really is revolutionary. And it's a product of two major trends. One is the rise of commerce and the rise of merchants from 1550 forward. The development of the Chinese community just expands dramatically from the later Ming period on through the Qing and up into the 19th and 20th centuries. And as time goes by, merchants become rich and they become important. And so they're a rising class. And if you study Western history or Japanese history in the Tokugawa period, merchants are a truly revolutionary class in creating a different political order. So how does that play out in China? The other major trend is the successive revolutions in military revolutions, the advances in technological development of militaries and the transformation of the way wars are fought require a much more powerful state to recruit an army, to get the money to pay for the army and the weapons that they use. They need a stronger bureaucracy to manage all these affairs, and they need some way of extracting resources and people out of society that are just tremendously different from the way traditional imperial regimes worked. And so the two most important changes I'm suggesting are, one, the rise of commerce and merchants, and the other, the impact on state capacities of modern warfare. And if you look at European, Western history, there's not one military revolution, there's a whole series of them. And they're more and more destructive and require greater and greater resources to produce. And so it requires a much more powerful state. And so, from my point of view, the modern Chinese state is much more powerful, much more capable than anything the Ming or the Qing ever dreamed of.
Yeah.
I argue that the imperial system was already being hollowed out by the rise of commerce and the consequent rise of population. The local districts, the Xin, governed 6 or 7 times the number of people they did in 1550 by the time we get to 1900. And so the problems of government are much more complicated, and merchants are becoming active. They're the real main force in the 1911 revolution, and they continue to be important on through the Republican period. The Nanjing period, under the old interpretation, looks like a failure, of bad leadership, corruption, and so forth, and nobody wanted to study it. But more recently, people in the U.S. have begun to re-examine that, and it becomes more and more clear that what Chiang Kai-shek and the Nanjing Republic tried to do was build a more powerful state. And it's a halfway step towards what the People's Republic developed. It had a party army. It was a party-driven state. It had a state ideology, the Sanminjuyi. It was the inventor of the Danwei system of organizing industries. So looked at in that context, it's not that far to get to what the People's Republic tried to do. And so as a consequence of that, my argument is politics and the nature of the state in the People's Republic period doesn't look anything at all like government and politics did in, say, the 16th century under the Ming. And the consequence of that is all of these comparisons that people draw between Xi Jinping is like an emperor. You see this all the time in American publications. It's just ridiculous. He's so much more powerful than any Ming emperor.
Yeah.
And the nature of foreign relations under the People's Republic since 1971 is so thoroughly based on nation-state sovereignty that this idea that they're trying to rebuild the Tianxia system is just ridiculous in my perspective. You look at Xi Jinping's speeches on this community of common destiny that all the world should be organized. He's talking about equality among civilizations. That's not traditional. That's based on nation-state sovereignty. It's just the opposite. So I know there are Chinese intellectuals who like to talk about Tianxia, but I don't see any reflection of that in what Beijing says.
So the century of humiliation is not a communist invention, but actually a nationalist invention.
Both of those parties share that same
Yeah.
line of argument. They just disagree about who's the real inheritor of Sun Zhongshan's
Yes.
ideology.
And who has the right revolution to carry out.
That's right.
But I mean, my question to you is that it seems this nationalist or revolutionary historiography was later migrated to America and became some sort of received wisdom within academic circles and even in the broader public. I mean, even when I've noticed instances where even someone criticizes China, they try to give a little, right, to take a little, and the give tends to be the Opium War and the corrupt Qing court and the rightfulness.
The conventional framework that I sketched, based on 1840 for the Opium War and 1949, really is built on that same idea.
So could you speak to one, how is that conventional wisdom created in America, and two, what's the impact of that narrative?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. China studies in this country really goes back to the immediate years after World War II. And so people like King Fairbank were the creators of what comes to be the conventional interpretation of modern Chinese history that everybody since has worked with. And I know Fairbank, for example, disagreed with some elements of it. He was basically an apologist for imperialism. And he argued in his first book, Trade and Diplomacy on the China Coast. And it's basically on the period from the Opium War to the Second Opium War in 1857-60, the Arrow War. He argued that the Qing adapted to the creation of the treaty ports in the same way they used to adapt to foreign peoples under the Qing Empire and let them live according to their own customs and their own legal traditions within the broader framework of the Qing Empire. He argued that's just a traditional response. It's not a reflection necessarily of Western imperialism, but he's assuming that broader picture that the West was responsible for creating this pattern of behavior that the Chinese call the century of humiliation. He's a bit of an apologist for that, but he assumes that same framework. Fairbank was in China during all that period, the 30s and 40s. So I think he just inherited it, and so did most Americans for a long period of time. The generations of scholars that Fairbank and others basically repeated that framework, but more recently some people have begun raising questions about that. And I'm one of them. I'm very skeptical of it. I don't think that's the right way to understand contemporary China. That's what my book's about.
Yeah. Why does it matter, essentially?
I think it matters in trying to understand from a proper perspective what China is today. It doesn't look to me like a traditional empire. It doesn't look like a dynastic regime. It looks like a modern state in many respects and has many of the same capabilities. And if we think of it in the wrong terms, we'll formulate wrong policy. It's that simple. That's why it's important. Aside from me, I just think it's intellectually responsible. Yeah.
And the legacy of the Republican period is quite complicated because you have the pro-democratic strand, which historians are trying to excavate to show actually China could have been set on a different path.
Yes, absolutely.
But there are also the autocratic trends, which obviously the Communist Party embraced and magnified.
Right.
Those are also part of the Republican period.
Yes, that's right. I blame Japan. If the Japanese hadn't invaded, I doubt that the communists could have defeated the Kuomintang. If you look at 1936, the Kuomintang was getting stronger and stronger. They were beginning finally to overcome and assert better control of different regions of China that they couldn't at the very beginning in 1928. The pressure from Japan forced a militarized politics on the Kuomintang regime. And Jiang Jieshi was a military leader. He's a professional military man. To me, that underscores a deeper kind of crisis in Chinese politics, and that is that for the last century, the most important leaders in China are military people. Yuan Shikai, military guy. Jiang Jieshi, military guy. Mao Zedong, he's a political leader, but he's also a military leader. Deng Xiaoping, political leader, but his strength in the military was critical to his power. It's only in recent times, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, these were not military leaders. And that's an important transition. Xi Jinping has raised some question marks about that, but he's still not a military guy, not by career. Yes, well, the Republican period could have gone really differently, and I blame Japan. They had their own reasons, and
Mao Zedong personally thanked the Japanese Prime Minister for fighting the nationalists.
Yeah, that's right. So if there had not been the Sino-Japanese War, things would have been different. Mm-hmm. In 1936, at the end of the Long March, the communists were in real trouble. They were vastly reduced in numbers. Jiang was beginning to get ready to launch a sixth campaign to try to wipe out the communists. It could have been quite different.
Did you ever have this sort of sense of frustration whereby you come from a history background? So I would presume that your natural intellectual instinct would be to dive into longer term trends.
Yes, well, I usually say that I work on contemporary affairs for money, but I work on long-term history for love. And I have to make a living, and working in the agency was a very good job. It was interesting. I could use some of the skills I had, but my perspective was just different. Many people who study contemporary China, both in government but also in academia, are political scientists. I'm very critical of political scientists. I think it's a fraud. And I complain about it all the time. I have very good friends who are political scientists, and we have fun ridiculing each other. But the standard joke about political scientists are you put a collection of political scientists in a room, and they'll talk all day without ever touching a fact. And if you got a bunch of historians in a room, they'll talk all day and never come up with a theory. And so there's just a basic divide.
Sounds like you should put them all in the same room.
Yeah, they don't get along very well. And I've always been critical of, for political scientists, 1949 is the key date.
Right.
But if you look at it from historical pattern, you have to look at the Republican period and even elements in the later Qing period to understand how we got here. Mm. So, and I am very critical of many of the things that contemporary specialists in government think. I started to say that essay I'll send you is a criticism of the people who work on contemporary affairs, think they know and have a good understanding of what happened in traditional times. But the point of my essay is to say that scholarship on traditional times in the United States have gone so much farther from when they were in graduate school and might have taken a single course on China from the Neolithic period down to 1900. So what they understand is both old and based on the conventional understanding, and it's just completely overthrown by recent generations of people who specialize in traditional times. I'll send you that essay.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to read it.
So I get talked to by people in government still who ask me about, don't I think the tributary system is what Xi Jinping has in mind? And don't you think that Xi Jinping really looks like an emperor? And, simple ideas like that. Who was the most aggressive Ming emperor in terms of expansion? None of them. Yongle maybe for a while, but he was the only one. Most of the time the Ming was on the defensive against the Mongols. And so, it's exasperating because they think they understand traditional Chinese history, but they don't know anything.
And after you left CIA, you first went to Johns Hopkins, and then in 1999 you moved to the Hoover Institution at Stanford and worked on the China Leadership Monitor.
And what's the original design of China Leadership Monitor?
Mike Oxenberg noticed correctly that nobody was paying attention to Chinese leadership politics. And the reason is it's a hard field because the information is just not there and easy to get at. And academics really don't have any good means to do it. And so he thought there ought to be attention to leadership politics, especially as it pertained to specific policy areas. And so the original monitor scheme was there would be 6 of us working together. I would edit it and run it, but there would be 5 other people in specific areas. And so we got James Melvinen to write up military affairs as it figures into leadership politics, Barry Naughton at UCSD to write about the economy. Lee Chung at Brookings in those days wrote about provincial leadership and connections to Beijing. Tom Christensen at Columbia, he wasn't at Columbia then, he was at Cornell or maybe MIT. Anyway, wrote about foreign policy, and when he left, I got Alan Romberg, who focused specifically on Taiwan. And so then I split international affairs into Taiwan policy and international affairs, foreign policy, and got different people. But the idea was the same person would write in each area 4 times a year. I preferred to get people who had government experience or think tank experience. Academics are going to write about their political theories. Nobody's interested in that.
Who was the leadership monitor targeted at?
We wanted to focus on the foreign policy community. I ran ads for it in Foreign Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations Journal, and especially people in government. And so I had money to go take trips to Washington to go talk to people in the intelligence community, at state, at Congress. We were really trying to hit people who were engaged in policy.
Did you meet anyone interesting at Stanford, especially from China?
Occasionally. I can't think of the man's name, who was secretary. One of the most interesting people was secretary to I think to first Zhao Ziyang, then Jiang Zemin, and then Hu Jintao. And he wrote speeches for all 3 leaders. I can't think of his name. It's terrible to get old. You forget things. He was a very well-connected person, obviously, and it was obvious that you could get him to talk about these things, and then you just stop because it got too sensitive. Which, my rule of thumb has always been anybody who tells you they know what's going on in the Politburo obviously doesn't know.
Except this guy.
Well, he did know, but he wouldn't talk about
right.
it, except in very careful circumstances. But lots of other people say, I had one friend came and told me the real story, what's going on, and what he did was he pulled out the latest issue of the Hong Kong journal Zhengming, which just rumors and all sorts of stuff, and it confirmed my suspicion that people who think they know what's going on just don't, because the people who do know won't talk about it. It's the same in Washington politics. All sorts of people will say, well, I know what's going on in the Oval Office. Well, they have no idea.
Then methodologically, how can you know? Especially from afar.
We use the traditional methods, the criminological methods that I talked about before. There's no question about the authenticity of what's said in People's Daily.
Official, yeah.
It's official. You can count on it. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is how does what they're saying change over time in response to contemporary situations. And we all use that method, basically.
Did you know the people of Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars?
I knew some of them. I didn't really agree with their perspective.
Why not?
I thought they were unrealistic. I thought the Vietnam War was a mistake because the U.S. was intervening in a nationalistic struggle and should have learned that you try to take part in a nationalistic war, it's a losing struggle because you're fighting a people who are politically aroused and will do anything to save their country. Later, for example, it's been calculated that the North Vietnamese suffered 4 times the casualties in fighting the Americans that the Japanese did fighting the Americans. And so it's just a measure of the nationalistic spirit that motivated him, not to mention the authoritarian regime. But I thought the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars was just unrealistic in their criticisms of American foreign policy. I really did think the Soviet Union was dangerous. I was not sympathetic to the People's Republic. I loved China and its history, and Chinese people were great. I just didn't think the regime was something to be admired because of the Great Leap and the Cultural Revolution. They just appeared grotesque to me. I don't know if I mentioned this, I worked for 2 years between undergraduate years and graduate school for the CIA. And then after graduate school I became an analyst. And I was a translator for those 2 years. And my main job was to translate Red Guard newspapers, Hongwei Bingbao. And I had studied all sorts of traditional China and just fascinated by that and admired China's amazing civilization and so forth. And then sat down and read Red Guard attacks on the Communist Party leadership. This is just awful, and getting family members to criticize other family members and what it was doing to Chinese society, I thought was just grotesque.
I mean, the question of Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, and to what extent did American intellectual community and policy community know about it?
Not many people paid attention to the Great Leap, but in the agency we knew about it. And the scale of starvation, Chinese authorities today say 20 to 30 million people died of starvation, and some Western estimates are even higher.
Yeah.
Because we could see the impact of it. Refugees trying to get into Hong Kong, and they would tell stories about people eating soil. Or eating grass because there was no other food.
Or eating each other.
It was terrible.
Yeah.
I remember people bringing that up in the later 60s when I was in graduate school, and some of the left wing says, oh, that's just propaganda, it's not true.
Propaganda by whom?
By right-wingers in the United States. I'm not a right-winger, but I am trying to be realistic. And calculated foreign policy based on realism. What's in the best interests of all sides? And those kinds of debates were just, for me, off-putting. The Cultural Revolution, a lot of people were very interested in it. The Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars types thought this was a great thing that Americans could learn from. I remember when Nixon went to China in February '72, the American media went with him. And so a lot of commentators, Shirley MacLaine, an actress, even William F. Buckley, a conservative, were saying, what a great thing, the civic spirit the Chinese have. And they were talking about the first night in Beijing, it had snowed. And so there was snow all over the streets. And people came out of their houses to sweep the streets clean of snow. And all these commentators said, oh, what a great civic spirit the Chinese have. This is something we should all learn from in our society. Not recognizing that this was enforced by the regime. They had to do that. It wasn't just because, oh, let's go do this. So voluntary. So there's just kind of an unrealism in positions that I found just ridiculous.
I'm constantly wondering about how to understand America's shift in attitudes towards China, both in, engaging with China and now in shifting to the other side of decoupling. And
engagement started with Nixon. It was built on a strategic foundation, not economic. Collaboration with the Soviet Union at a time when the U.S. thought the Soviet Union's power was rising and America's was declining. And there was a convergence of interest between Beijing and Washington that both Mao and Nixon and Kissinger recognized.
Right.
Up through that time, the academic attitudes towards China were kind of romantic and excited because now people who had been studying China for years could now actually go to China. And so there was all this excitement and so forth. But it was kind of romantic, and everybody, a lot of people thought Mao was a great revolutionary and all that kind of baloney. Finally, the party's own criticism of Mao in 80 and 81 meant that a lot of academics said, oh, maybe Mao wasn't so great after all. And so that introduced a note of skepticism. But that didn't really dent the excitement of working in China. Meanwhile, on an economic level, China was joining the world economically, and the U.S. was backing it, and so forth. 89 was a shock, I think, to a lot of academics. It wasn't terribly surprising if you looked at the longer span of the way the regime operates. But it was only temporary, and for the business community, engagement continued. And finally, with Beijing joining the WTO in 2001, after a very prolonged negotiation, people were still very confident. Engagement's working and working. What really caused the change, as far as I can tell, was the change under the Xi Jinping administration, and it surprised a lot of people. People were thinking, well, Xi is a reformer. And in some sense, he is. He did try to change the system for the better, but what's the standard for better? More control, more stability. My sense of it is that the regime faced a kind of real crisis, and the lessons of the Soviet collapse were really relevant. Well, that's why Xi Jinping keeps pounding on that.
Why do China specialists in America keep coming back to the question, how do we get China so wrong? That seemed to be the question after Cultural Revolution, right? When people had the Maoist romanticism, and then,
yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. It's hard to get China right, and China changes sometimes in shocking ways. When the Cultural Revolution erupted, it shocked everybody for a while, because everybody thought, well, China's stable like Stalin's Russia was. How did we get, obviously, the differences, the severe differences between China's top leaders? How didn't we understand that? And then, these kinds of things happen.
It seems that, there are repeatedly big calls. Big calls that were wrong.
Sure.
The nature of Mao's regime.
Yeah.
Where the 80s could go. I mean, it ended in a massacre that few foresaw.
Yeah.
And then I don't know what's the big call for Kuomintang and Jiang Zemin, but for Xi Jinping certainly.
Yes.
That,
right.
People
As I
thought
said,
he
a lot
was
of people did.
a reformer.
But if you were paying attention in 08 and 9 and 10, you could see there were tensions, problems the leadership was facing, and there were 9 people on the standing committee at that point, that they were issues were hard to resolve, and there wasn't any resolution, and so the leadership obviously couldn't come to a decision on what to do. And so when Xi did turn, it wasn't that surprising, especially when you read that report that Hu Jintao delivered at the 18th Party Congress.
And how come, do you think, so few foresaw the rise of Xi Jinping, and that, Xi Jinping shocked people?
Well, everybody, or at least I thought everybody, knew Xi was going to become the general secretary. I wrote an article in the Monitor which showed that Xi and Li Keqiang were both appointed to the standing committee in that year at the 17th Congress. But if you looked at what Xi was doing and what Li was doing, Li was being prepared to become premier, by his activities, and Xi was doing stuff that you'd expect a successor to the party leadership was doing. And so, a lot of us thought Xi was going to be the general secretary. I think it's people who didn't follow closely the internal politics of the party in those days were the ones that were surprised. People in the business community, for example, were really taken aback, and especially after the 2013 third plenum, the reform policies that didn't really go anywhere. They were really disappointed by that. And then the corruption campaigns expanded, and so the turn in the business community, American business community, I think is really decisive.
I wonder, from your perspective, would it have been better if engagement didn't happen, if Nixon sort of choked off the Communist Party and never gave it a lifeline after Cultural Revolution?
Nope. I think that was the whole American approach in the 50s and 60s was just wrong. I agree with George Kennan. He said that the failure to recognize Beijing in 1950, 49-50, was one of the greatest mistakes in American foreign policy. You want to have influence, you have to be there. And trying to isolate China, as the U.S. did fairly vigorously for 20 years, creates more problems than it solves. China wasn't going to break under Mao. And in fact, they developed nuclear weapons on their own after the Soviets left. And, times were not good, and it was a poor country, but it was going to survive. So the changes that came from engagement since Mao, actually just before Mao, I think are positive.
Mm. Do you think today's debate is just a variant of that who lost China debate?
No, I don't think there aren't many of us who are, most people these days are too young to remember that.
Well, maybe not consciously, but in terms of like the sort of dynamics, the questions being asked.
I think it's maybe more fundamental, and that is, who's our enemy now? It doesn't reflect a concern over Soviet expansionism or communist expansionism. Who's threatening us now? The Soviet Union is gone. Who's the next big kid to worry about? My view is its engagement worked. It was doing exactly what people have said. It was creating a more vibrant and successful and prosperous and freer society in a lot of ways under Jiang Zemin and on into Hu Jintao's period. But it created political conditions for a reversal in China, and that surprised everybody. So my conclusion wasn't that engagement failed. It was working so well that Xi Jinping had to stomp on it. Which is what he's been doing. But it created disappointment in this country. And meanwhile, as China's capabilities have grown, its economy has grown, its military capabilities have evolved, people outside China studies said, oh, this is a big country and it looks like it's powerful. And so we need a new enemy. And we've got one, it's China. And so all kinds of people who aren't really China specialists jumped onto it and have discredited engagement as an approach and advocated for much tougher containment type policies. I've read their stuff, and they're constantly misreading what the Chinese say. They impute to China things that they don't mean to say, obviously don't mean if you actually read the original statements. And so there's a kind of unreality to aspects of what's the consensus approach in Washington these days towards China. That's poorly based, and I think from a longer term perspective, counterproductive. I support engagement because I don't think the United States can change China, can change the regime, but I think the Chinese people can. And so what sorts of policies will support that? Well, cutting off contacts with China's society through containment policies doesn't do that. That policy makes it easy for the regime to say, all our problems are the goddamn Americans' fault because they're trying to contain us, and so forth. And so you lose the support of Chinese nationalism and make it easy for the regime to claim that support. Also, engagement and contacts with Chinese society of all sorts, artistic and academic and economic and so forth, build constituencies in China that have an interest in a positive relationship with the West. And they will, if to the degree that they can, try to influence the direction of politics in the regime to liberalize it. And they offer the best possibility of change in China, political change. And so you don't advance that by undercutting them with cutting off relations and economic stresses and strains that makes it easy for the regime to blame the outsiders, not their own policies. So again, since the 60s, I've always supported engagement. To me, it's the most revolutionary policy.
And did the fact that you changed your gender impact your work at all?
I was worried that it would, but it didn't, at least as far as I know. When I transitioned in 2006, I talked to Jean Oy, who was the head of the East Asian Studies program. We went out to lunch, and I told her I'm going to change my gender. And she said, be strong, go for it. And she was very supportive. Hoover, which was quite conservative, I thought would be negative. I went to talk to the executive director, Richard Souza, in those days, and told him what I was going to do. And he said, well, I know it's a big step for you, but it's not for Hoover. You're not the first to transition here. And so they were fine with it. They changed the name on my office door the very next day I went to the office. And then finally I was teaching at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, and that's an American military institution. I thought surely I would be fired. This was the days of don't ask, don't tell for gay people, and trans people I couldn't imagine would be would be even less acceptable. But I told the department chairman, and he said, well, let me check it out with human resources. And I got a call about 3 days later from the school's human resource people, and they said, how can we help? You're not the first to transition here, and so let's work out how this will play out. So my big concern was, it would affect my livelihood and my jobs, and in all cases, it went fine. So I was shocked, because a lot of times it doesn't go well for people. So I'm grateful.
Did you ever have problems in terms of your transition with others? I don't know. It seems to me the Chinese community can be somewhat transphobic.
Yeah, nobody. I haven't experienced a negative experience from anybody. I have given talks at the CIA. I had a contract for a while to go give talks on what I thought was going on. This was when I was leading the China Leadership Monitor. And they had no problem at all with it anymore. When I first worked for them, if you were gay, and nobody knew what trans was in those days, if you were gay, they thought you'd be blackmailable. They finally figured out that you're only blackmailable if you're secretive about your gender or gayness, and now there's no problem with it. And so I've given talks and walked by the employee activities bulletin board, and there's a gay trans support group operating in the agency, and they didn't care about it either. So I just haven't had at least that I know of. There may be people who said, well, I'm not going to invite that person.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, it hasn't happened.
With that, this is the end of our episode today. I hope you enjoyed it. Do subscribe to Peking Hotel wherever you get your podcast, and also on Substack. So I'll talk to you next time.